Go whenever you want.
Bob,
I'm sorry?
are you selling your books also?
In 1937, the great Mongol warrior Genghis Khan lost his soul, some 7 centuries after he actually died. According to Mongol tradition, a warrior's soul is contained in his spirit banner. Spirit banner takes a clump of the hair from the warrior's horse and attaches it to a spear. Now, for a long time after Genghis Khan's death, his spirit banner had been housed in a Buddhist monastery in central Mongolia, where the local lamas or religious teachers had tended to it. But by the 1930s, Mongolia was then under communist control and closely allied with Stalin's Soviet Union. During that decade of the 1930s, the communists in the Soviet Union launched a brutal anti-religious campaign, which destroyed many monasteries. They executed some 2,000 monks, and all of the chaos surrounding this anti-religious campaign led to the vanishing of Genghis Khan's spirit banner and thus his soul. Now, jump ahead to the end of the 20th century. As communism faded away in Mongolia and elsewhere, even so, the memory of Genghis Khan, if not his spirit banner, made a remarkable comeback. By now, at the present time, a particular brand of vodka, a chocolate bar, 2 brands of beer, the country's best rock band, and the central square of the capital city all bore his name, and his picture was on Mongolia's money and on stamps as well. Just last year, in 2022, they celebrated the 860th birthday of Genghis Khan, as symbolized by this huge statue. Now, all of this is sort of a reminder of the enormous and really astonishing role that the Mongols played in the Eurasian world of the 13th and 14th centuries. So the Mongol era was roughly 1200 to 1400 or 1450. It is a reminder to us of the, it serves as a useful corrective to the almost exclusive focus that historians place on agricultural societies and their civilizations. Because the Mongols and other people like them were pastoral nomads. They were not agricultural people. They inhabited lands that were not suitable for agriculture. And here we're talking about the steppe lands of inner Eurasia, parts of the Middle East, the Arabian Desert, for example, parts of North Africa, the Sahara Desert, and some places in Eastern Africa. These were the homes of pastoral nomadic people who more or less disdained farming while centering their economies around their herds of animals. Normally, they did not construct big cities, huge empires, monumental works of art or architecture, and they were generally not literate and not given to creating written literature. Nonetheless, these pastoral nomads made a real mark on the development of the entire Eastern Hemisphere, and particularly on the agricultural civilizations with which they interacted. So perhaps a brief word, before we get on to the Mongols in particular, a brief word about the role of pastoral peoples in world history. Perhaps their great achievement was to master environments which were not suitable for agriculture. because it takes a lot of pasture land to support a small population, pastoral societies had much less dense populations than agricultural civilizations. People generally lived in scattered settlements. They moved seasonally. They were not randomly wandering around the world, but they were moving in accordance with where water was available and where pasture land was available. These are some Mongol pastoralists. And these are a couple of more or less traditional Mongol settlements. Another interesting feature about pastoral peoples in general is that their women generally had a higher status and more equality with their menfolk than women in agricultural societies. Pastoral people were also technologically creative. They generated all sorts of technological innovations, complex horse harnesses, saddles that had iron stirrups, a small kind of bow that could be fired from horseback, various kinds of armor, new kinds of swords, and a lot of other things. Furthermore, pastoral peoples, although they disdained agriculture, were nonetheless semi-dependent upon their agricultural neighbors and certainly interacted with them. They desired the products of agricultural societies, their luxury products like silk, as well as their agricultural products, because few nomadic societies, few pastoral societies could live entirely from their herds of animals. Now, the most visible entry of these pastoral people on the stage of world history occurred as nomadic empires spread across the lands of Inner Eurasia and elsewhere. It was the military capacity of these horse-riding warriors that enabled the construction of these large empires. They rode horsebacks and in some cases camels, and in general they represented a real challenge to and an influence upon the agrarian civilizations which were adjacent to their borders. Arabs, Turks, and Mongols, all of them of nomadic origin, created the largest and most influential empires in the world between roughly 500 and 1500. So during that 1,000-year period, 500 to 1500, these pastoral peoples, Arabs, Turks, and the Mongols, really made a splash on the larger stage of world history. Furthermore, the most expansive religious tradition of that era, Islam, was the product of a pastoral people, the Arabs, and Islam was carried to new regions by another pastoral people, the Turks. In that millennium, 500 to 1500, most of the great civilizations of Outer Eurasia, Byzantium, Persia, China, India, had come under the control of nomadic people, at least for a time. And of those people among the pastoral people who made this big splash on the stage of world history, none were more impressive than the Mongols. The Mongols created the largest land-based empire in all of human history. It stretched all across Eurasia, as you can see in the map, from China in the east to Europe in the west. It had a profound impact on neighboring civilizations, China, Persia, Russia, and Eastern Europe. And this was really an astonishing development. Consider the numbers The Mongols numbered somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million people. That was it. China alone had a population of 100 million. So it is enormously surprising, given the demographics, that the Mongols were able to construct this large empire. It was impressive while it lasted, but frankly, it didn't leave much behind. The Arab Empire left behind a new religion, Islam, and it left behind its language, Arabic, in many of the places that it conquered. The Mongols did neither. Their language today is limited to Mongolia, and they created no new religion, no new civilization, and they had, over the long term, a relatively modest impact on the world that they had briefly governed. So I want to turn now to the making of the Mongol Empire. How in the world was this possible? What made this possible? Historians are reluctant to credit too much to a single individual. But in the case of the Mongols, we are almost forced to consider carefully the role of one person, Genghis Khan. It was he came from a family that was in deep distress. His family had lost all standing in society. They were reduced to the role of hunters and gatherers. Really, they were at the lowest level of Mongol society. But Genghis Khan proved to be quite a resourceful fellow. It was he who actually united the scattered Mongol clans or tribes into a single nation. He drew on his personal magnetism or charisma. He was very skillful politically in navigating the politics of the Mongol peoples. And he had a reputation of being very generous to friends and being ruthless to his enemies. And so in 1206, at a grand assembly of Mongol nobles, Genghis Khan was proclaimed the supreme leader of the great Mongol nation, now united really for the first time. What followed then was what one historian called the Mongol World Wars. It was about 75 years of intermittent military campaigning, which created that. It was, of course, a conquest empire, as all empires are. And so the question is, what made it possible? Since the Mongols had so few people, and they certainly did not have any great technological advantage over their neighbors. The key to Mongol success, by all historical accounts, lay in their army. According to one scholar, quote, Mongol armies were simply better led, organized, and disciplined than those of their opponents. All men and some women were trained in horseback warrior capabilities, as illustrated here. So they could draw upon almost the entire male population and some portion of the female population for their military forces. Furthermore, they borrowed siege technology from the Chinese, which they used to their advantage in many of their battles. So the Mongols were not proud. They borrowed what they could from the more advanced technology of their neighbors. Furthermore, the strict discipline of the Mongol armies and their loyalty to their rulers made possible the elaborate tactics of encirclement, retreat, and deception that proved very effective in many a battle. As the empire grew, it generated resources which reinforced Mongol military superiority and benefited many of the Mongols themselves, who could now wear silk rather than felt clothing, and could even have slaves that were derived from prisoners of war. Furthermore, they incorporated very large numbers of conquered people into their military forces. These conquered people served as laborers, sometimes as warriors. They built roads and bridges. They carried supplies over long distances. They also identified artisans, craftspeople, and other skilled people, spared them from massacre, and shipped them all over to the Mongol Empire, wherever they could be used. There is a story of a French goldsmith who was captured in Hungary and wound up in the capital city of the Mongols in Karakoram, where he built an elaborate silk fountain that dispensed various alcoholic beverages. A further feature of the Mongol conquests that assisted their military success was a growing reputation for sheer brutality. What's
Your cursor. Oh, sorry.
there? Here is a direct quote from Genghis Khan. "Whoever submits shall be spared, but those who resist, they shall be destroyed with their wives, children, and dependents, so that others who hear and see should fear and not act the same." But beyond this, there were other, what shall we say, more positive features of Mongol policy that enabled their military and governing success. They had an elaborate census system, which allowed them to know sort of what they had at available to them in terms of manpower and resources. They also had a very effective system of relay about a day's ride apart, which made possible rapid communication across the vast expanses of the Mongol Empire. Furthermore, they had a series of policies which appealed to various groups of people. The Mongols were interested in fostering commerce. They themselves were not very active traders, but they offered merchants often a 10% above their asking price to get them to do business within the Mongol Empire. And they allowed them free use of the relay stations to transport their goods across large distances. Furthermore, they made use of other people in governing the empire. Usually, Mongols were at the top. But below that, they used a lot of Muslims and Chinese as administrators in parts of their empire. And interestingly enough, the Mongols were very religiously tolerant. They had no interest in imposing their own shamanistic religion on their conquered people. And in fact, they supported and encouraged and welcomed many religious traditions, Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Taoist, and others, as long as they did not become the focus of political opposition. This is a picture of one of the Mongol rulers with his Christian wife. Several of them had wives who were Nestorian Christians. Nestorian Christianity had been established in China for some time, and the fact that Mongol rulers could marry these women is an illustration of their religious toleration. Now, the Mongol Empire was a kind of arena of cultural encounter between nomadic pastoral people on the one hand and agricultural civilizations on the other. There are a whole series of these encounters. I want to briefly highlight for you a couple of them. First was China. At the time of the Mongol conquest, China was divided between North and South. The Song dynasty ruled the South, and northern China was ruled at that time by another pastoral people. the Mongols conquered northern China by about 1230 and southern China by 1279. Then the question was, what were they going to do with China? One possibility that was seriously considered was that they would simply exterminate everybody and use these lands as pasture lands for their flocks. This was particularly considered for North China, less so for South. However, and fortunately for the Chinese, they decided not to do this, but rather to exploit the wealth of China rather than to simply exterminate all of its people. But exploiting the wealth of China meant some accommodation to Chinese culture. In the first place, and one form of accommodation was to define themselves as a new Chinese dynasty called the Yuan, Y-U-A-N. It simply means new beginning. So the Mongols tried to establish themselves as a new Chinese dynasty. And frankly, this was appreciated by a fair number of elite Chinese, because for them, a unified China was the norm. And the fact that China had been divided was kind of a disgrace. And so they admired the fact that the Mongols were able to bring China back to a state of political unity. Furthermore, the Mongols used China's bureaucracy, its taxation system, for their own purposes. Many of the Mongol rulers sought to act like a benevolent Chinese emperor. Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, who was the ruler of China, built roads and canals, lowered taxes, supported Confucian temples and Taoist shrines, and especially favored Tibetan forms of Buddhism. All of this in the spirit of behaving in the way that a benevolent Chinese emperor was supposed to behave. But not in everything. For example, the Mongols pretty much ignored this very ancient Chinese examination system by which young boys were highly trained in Confucian philosophy and history, and then rose through various levels of the exam system to positions in the bureaucracy. The Mongols largely ignored that and simply appointed people to administrative positions. Furthermore, relatively few Mongols in China actually learned Chinese, and they actively tried to forbid Chinese from learning the Mongol script. Furthermore, Mongol women did not behave like Chinese women. They did not bind their feet. By this time, foot binding was becoming increasingly popular among the ruling classes of China. This is a picture that shows Genghis Khan here riding with a woman, his wife, a woman friend. No one quite knows exactly who she is, but Mongol women, very much unlike Chinese women, associated with men in public spaces. Mongol rule, however, was harsh, and it was widely resented. You know, Marco Polo was in China during the Mongol era, and he reported that for many Chinese, they felt like they were treated just like slaves, as Marco Polo reported. They apparently demanded bribes, they conducted executions, they took Chinese women more or less at will, and so Chinese rule was resented. It was also relatively brief. By 1368, the Chinese had chased the Mongols out of China. The Mongol ruling class was highly factionalized. Taxes were going up. There were peasant rebellions in the countryside, and by 1368, the Chinese had simply, the Mongols had simply packed up and moved back to Mongolia. The next Chinese dynasty is known as the Ming, and it actively tried to erase all evidence of the Mongol period and to return to a Confucian-based set of values and practices. However, the memory of this traumatic period in their history persisted, and Chinese, for some time to come, were wary of what was going on north of the Great Wall. Would the Mongols return? It was a persistent concern for several hundred years. Now, if we turn to Persia, we have a somewhat different story. Between 1219 and 1258, there were several invasions of Persia, several Mongol invasions of Persia that resembled nothing in Persian history. Persia had been invaded by the Arabs and other peoples, but they had experienced nothing to compare with the brutality of the Mongol assault. Juvani was a Persian historian who wrote this about the Mongol invasion. Every town and every village has been several times subjected to pillage and massacre and has suffered this confusion for years, so that even though there be generations and increase until the resurrection, the population will not attain to a 10% of what it was before. One example of this was in 1258 when the Mongols sacked the city of Baghdad, thus bringing an end to the Abbasid Caliphate, and some 200,000 people were massacred, as reported by the Mongol conqueror himself. Beyond the devastation of the conquest was the impact of the Mongols. Their herds did huge damage to agriculture and the peasants who lived on the land. They were forced to pay heavy taxes, and those taxes were collected with considerable brutality. The herds grazed the pasture land of Persia to a desert in some places. But, and this is an interesting contrast with China, the Mongols in Persia were transformed by Persia in a way that the Mongols in China were not transformed by Chinese culture. In 1295, the Mongol ruler in Persia converted to Islam. And this is a tent version of a mosque. This part here represents the mihrab, the part of a mosque that points in the direction of Mecca so that you know how to face when doing the prayers. But in 1295, the Mongol ruler of Persia converted to Islam, and thereafter many other Mongols followed suit. Some of them, furthermore, learned Persian, became settled down farmers, abandoning their nomadic pastoral ways, and some of them married Persian women. And so at the end of the 14th century, when there was no successor, no legitimate successor to the last Mongol ruler, the Mongols simply disappeared. They did not return to Mongolia. They simply became assimilated into Persian society as Muslims and lost their separate identity. So from a Persian point of view, they, the Persians, had civilized their barbarian conquerors. Now, the Mongol Empire created an interacting Eurasian network that stretched all the way across the Eastern Hemisphere. It was an important step in the direction of what we now refer to as globalization. And it took shape in at least three different ways. One was a transcontinental economy. The Mongols themselves did not produce much for trade. They didn't produce much that was of value in distant markets. Nonetheless, as I mentioned before, they consistently promoted international commerce, largely so that they could tax it. They provided financial support for the caravans that plied the Silk Road trading network. They gave tax breaks to merchants, and perhaps most importantly, they provided a secure environment across this huge area of land that could facilitate these commercial caravans going back and forth. Marco Polo, shown here on his knees before the Chinese emperor, was only the most famous of many European merchants who made this trip across the Silk Road network, across these very harsh deserts. In fact, there were so many of them that there were guidebooks published that gave advice for making this journey across these huge distances. A lot of these guys returned back to Europe with tales of rich lands and prosperous commercial opportunities, but what they described was what had long been in operation in Asia, of which Europeans were largely ignorant. Furthermore, the Mongol trading network here was only one part of a much larger set of trading relationships that crisscrossed Afro-Eurasia at this period of time, the 1200s, the 1300s. So this is a good map that sort of illustrated what I was speaking about last time, about early globalization. But this Mongol network generated or intersected with many of the other trading systems. Now, not only was there commerce on an international transcontinental scale, but there was also diplomacy. The Mongols invaded Russia in the early 1200s, in the 1240s, and the Mongol invasion of Russia spilled over into Eastern Europe. And in 1241, 1242, Mongol armies destroyed Polish, German, and Hungarian forces and seemed poised to march on Western Europe. Here is a slide that illustrates their conquest of Poland. Here is the head of a fellow named Henry II, who was a High Duke of Poland, and they are laying siege to a Polish city there. However, the Mongols decided not to march on into Western Europe. Two things apparently contributed to this decision. One was that the great Mongol ruler, I'm forgetting which one it was by this time, died, and they had to go back home for the funeral. The other thing was that apparently the Mongols did not find European grasslands adequate for pasturing their huge herds of animals. And so they did not proceed to conquer Western Europe. Now, here is an interesting what-if question. It's useful sometimes to ask these counterfactual questions about what happened in history. What do you think would have happened if the Mongols had decided to continue. And there was nothing apparent that would have stopped their continuation, to move into the Baltic areas, to move into France, maybe to cross the Channel into England. But how might history have turned out differently if the Mongols had continued? It's an interesting question to consider. It is at least possible that it would have resulted in the kind of devastation that others had experienced, and thus would have changed the course of European history. Perhaps the Europeans would have been so busy with the Mongols, they would not have had time or energy to go exploring the oceans and conquering the rest of the world. Who knows? In any event, here is a road not taken that had consequences. The Europeans, however, although they were no doubt grateful that the Mongols did not pursue their conquests in Western Europe, they were worried about it. And so they sent a variety of delegations. Both the Pope and various European rulers sent delegations there. This slide illustrates one of those delegations led by a fellow named Friar William of Rubruck, who visited the Mongols. And what they wanted was to learn something about Mongol intentions. At one point, one of the Mongol rulers sent back a letter saying that unless the Europeans surrendered to him, he would come in and wipe them out. Well, he didn't, and they didn't surrender. They also hoped to learn or to possibly make an alliance with the Mongols to continue the Crusades against the Islamic world. And at best, they hoped that they might be able to convert the Mongols to Christianity. So a fair number of these ambassadors that visited were Franciscan friars, like Friar William here. Now, none of that happened. The Mongols did not convert to Christianity. They did not invade Western Europe. They did not turn out to be allies to renew the Crusades. None of that happened. But what did happen, and perhaps the most impressive outcome of these diplomatic probings, was that Europeans got a lot of information about what was going on in the East. They brought back knowledge of this rich commercial network, of which Europeans were largely ignorant, and these reports contributed to a dawning European awareness of a wider world. Marco Polo's book was one of those things that was a part of this whole process. So there was a transcontinental economy, transcontinental diplomacy, and there was, third, a transcontinental cultural exchange. Now, Mongol policy forcibly transferred thousands of skilled craftsmen and educated people from their homelands to distant parts of the empire where they could be useful. The silversmith that I mentioned earlier is a concrete example. Furthermore, their religious toleration and their interest in commerce enticed a lot of missionaries and merchants to come in and do business in the Mongol Empire. Furthermore, the Mongol capital at Karakorum turned out to be quite a cosmopolitan place, with places of worship for Buddhists and Taoists and Muslims and Christians. There were actors and musicians from China. There was a wrestler or two from Persia, a jester from Byzantium to provide entertainment for the Mongol court. Persian and Arab doctors were sent to China, where they learned about acupuncture, actually. The Muslims didn't like acupuncture because it involved too much physical contact. And Chinese physicians and engineers found their skills useful in other parts of the Islamic world. A lot of Chinese inventions, technology, and artistic practices flowed westward: painting, printing, gunpowder weapons, compass-based navigation, high-temperature furnaces, medical techniques like acupuncture, and more. And Muslim astronomers were brought in to consult with Chinese authorities. Plants and crops likewise circulated within the Mongol domain. Lemons and carrots from the Middle East, for example, found a welcome reception in China. And it is arguable that Europeans gained more than most from this network of exchanges, because they had long been cut off from what was going on in Asia. And in comparison with the Islamic and Chinese worlds, the Europeans were clearly backward, technologically and otherwise. Now, they could reap the benefits of new technology, new crops, and new knowledge of a wider world without suffering the devastation of Mongol conquests. And so some scholars have argued that this set of circumstances, that Europeans were able to benefit from this new contact with Asia without suffering the devastation of conquest, that in these circumstances is one way to begin to understand Europe's remarkable rise to global dominance in the centuries that followed. However, any benefits that derive from participation in these Mongol networks of exchange have to be put alongside the catastrophe of the Black Death, because the Mongol Empire not only transmitted goods and diplomats and merchants, but it also transmitted diseases, particularly the diseases that were associated with the Black Death. In the densely populated civilizations of China, the Islamic world, and Europe, the plague, Black Death, claimed enormous numbers of victims, causing a sharp contraction of Eurasian populations for a century or more. In some parts of Europe, the death rates range from 50 to 90% in particular areas. It was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. Christian and Muslim thinkers alike spoke about the end of the world, that they had never seen or even imagined anything of this scale. Now, this is a topic all of its own, and I don't have time to go into it now, but it was one of the outcomes of the Mongol invasions. They didn't intend it, they didn't plan it, but the ease with which people could now travel over these long distances allowed them to spread the germs that caused this plague. A clergyman in England, far away from the center of all of this, wrote this about the plague: "For God is deaf nowadays and will not hear us, and for our guilt he grinds good men to dust." So the plague, which was at its height in the 1230s and 1240s, and returned periodically thereafter, had a devastating effect on the agricultural civilizations with which the Mongols interacted. It also had an effect in Mongolia, apparently, but we don't know as much about that. By 1350 or so, the Mongol Empire was in disarray. And within a century of that, the Mongols had lost control of China, Persia, Russia, and they had, of course, backed away from Europe. Furthermore, the Central Asian trade route, which was so critical to the Afro-Eurasian world economy, had largely closed. There was a vacuum in the international network. Who or what could replace the Mongols as an agent of creating some sense of order or interaction within this huge geographical area. Actually, there were two candidates for the job. The first was the Chinese, and the Chinese were more likely candidates for this job than anyone else. And the evidence of this came in the massive 15th century maritime voyages of the Chinese, led by a Muslim eunuch named Zheng He. The fleets that he commanded were enormous. There were tens of thousands of people on board hundreds of ships, some of them enormous ships. And they sailed throughout the Indian Ocean basin, to Southeast Asia, to India, to the coast of East Africa. So from China to East Africa, between 1405 and 1433, the Chinese launched 7 separate voyages, some of them of this enormous magnitude. They had the possibility of creating an enormous maritime empire in the Indian Ocean. But in 1433, the emperor who had sponsored these voyages died, and the court had turned against these voyages, thinking them unnecessary and wasteful, and opening and distracting China from the real source of danger, which is the barbarians to the north, the Mongols or other pastoral people to the north. And so these voyages were pulled back. They were allowed to rot in port. The records of these voyages were destroyed. And the Chinese voluntarily withdrew from an empire building project that they clearly had the capacity to create. It is not too often that we find a deliberate withdrawal from empire. Often, yes, a forced withdrawal, but not a conscious, voluntary withdrawal. This opened the door to the second candidate for replacing the Mongols, and this was the Europeans. The disruption of the Mongol-based trading networks provided an incentive for Europeans to get to the east in another way, through their maritime voyages. And so we have Columbus looking to get to Asia by going across the Atlantic. We have Vasco da Gama looking to get to Asia by going around the bottom of Africa and sailing across the Indian Ocean. So the Europeans took on the role of the Mongols in fostering world trade and in creating a network of communication and exchange, which turned out to be even larger than what the Mongols had created. Oops.
Hold on.
Here.
Wait. Should have done.
Can I go back? There we go. There we go. Here is an illustration of the difference between a European ship and one of these Chinese, enormous Chinese vessels. It is said that all of the boats that Columbus and Vasco da Gama had could be stored on the deck of one of these Chinese vessels. But what the Europeans lacked at that time in size, they made up for in persistence and aggressiveness. And so the Europeans turned out to be the successors of the Mongols on an even larger scale. And they shared some features with the Mongols. Like the Mongols, Europeans were people on the periphery of the established and major civilizations of the day. Like the Mongols, the Europeans were economically backward in comparison to Chinese and Islamic civilizations. The Europeans, like the Mongols, were prone to plunder by force the wealthier civilizations that they encountered. Now, the Europeans, of course, brought far more of their own culture and many more of their own people to the societies that they conquered. And of course, we know that European Christianity, European languages, European settlers, European science and technology took root within their empires. And their imperial presence lasted a lot longer than the Mongols did. Nonetheless, it is interesting that one well-known historian began to refer to Europeans as the Mongols of the seas. It's an interesting way to think about the role of Europeans in world history after the Mongols, that they took up the Mongol task of integrating the Eurasian world, and of course, more than that, the Afro-American Eurasian world was integrated by European empires, European commerce, and so forth. And so I think it is a useful way to think about the Europeans as the Mongols of the seas. Now, in conclusion, let me just say a word about the changing images of the Mongols and of pastoral people in general. The Mongols and other pastoral people have generally been portrayed in a negative way in history books. Those history books reflected the established prejudices of literate elites in these agrarian civilizations, which had been conquered by the so-called barbarians. They were seen, and these images were reflected in their history books. They were seen as barbaric, destructive, bloodthirsty. I could provide you with a whole series of quotes from European and Islamic and Chinese sources that describe these pastoral people in that way. Winners, we often say, write history, and the pastoralists were the losers. By 1500 or so, these pastoral societies of Eurasia had been swallowed up in the expanding Russian and Chinese empires, and they lost the kind of independent activity and agency that they had so dramatically demonstrated during the Mongol moment. Furthermore, and this is an interesting notion, recently, historians have been at pains to present a somewhat more balanced picture of pastoralists in general and the Mongols in particular, to emphasize what they created as well as what they destroyed. And so they have emphasized how the pastoral people were able to adapt to other environments that were not suitable for agriculture. Their technological innovations have been impressive. They fostered cultural interaction. Their remarkable empires, the relative freedom of their women, all of these things have been cited on the more positive side of the equation in dealing with pastoral people. Furthermore, the 20th century, I think, has also generated a different picture of the Mongols because of what happened in the 20th century. The total wars and genocide, World War I, World War II, and particularly nuclear wars, with its threat to obliterate entire societies. You know, a single nuclear weapon can vaporize any major city in the world in the snap of a finger. Those realities, I think, make the Mongols seem less unique, that their brutality, their willingness to massacre and exterminate large numbers of people to serve as an example to others, has perhaps, or maybe we could put it this way, that historians who have lived in the glass houses of modern life have been more reluctant to cast stones at the Mongols. Their utter brutality does not seem quite as unique in light of the world wars, the genocide, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the threat of nuclear annihilation. So it's a lesson, if you want one, that historians, like all of us, are shaped by the times and circumstances of our own lives as well as by what really happened in the past. And I think our changing image of the Mongols illustrates that reality. So let me stop here and see if you have Mongol observations or questions or, yeah.
Bob, what do you account for? How do you account for the difference between the way the Mongols' interaction with their occupation of China versus Persia that you referred to?
How do
Why were they so different? Or why do you think?
I'm not entirely sure how to respond to that. I think it had something to do with the decision of this one Mongol ruler in Persia to convert to Islam. Now, they did not try to extend that beyond Persia, but once he did that, then any alliance with the Europeans to continue the Crusades was out of the question. And that's what the Europeans were hoping for, that the Mongols in Persia would join them in renewing the Crusades in the Middle East. But once they accepted Islam, that was off the boards. In China, well, apparently what brought Mongol rule to an end in Persia was the failure to find a successor to the last Mongol ruler. The dynasty had run out of heirs, and so there was no obvious successor, and the Mongols didn't have a very good system for replacing their rulers. So by that time, the middle of the 14th century, the Mongols had sort of become Persian, had become assimilated. Exactly why that did not happen in China, I don't have a good explanation for it. I do know that many of the Mongol elites resisted succumbing to Chinese civilization. Many of them lived in Mongol-like tents, even in the capital city. They built a new capital city in what is now Beijing. And the inner courtyard of that was sort of like grasslands. They had tents rather than palaces. And so the Mongols in China seemed resistant to assimilating to Chinese culture. Precisely why that might have been the case is less clear to me. Gary, yeah.
Yes, I'm surprised you left out the Ottoman Turks when you're talking about successors to the Mongolian Empire, since they came like in the 1400s. They conquered Constantinople, and I noticed the Mongols never conquered Constantinople. Can you say something about that interaction?
Okay, actually, what I want to do for our next get-together is to look at a series of empires that took place in the 14, 15, 1600s and compare them. And the Ottomans were, of course, one of them.
So come back.
Yes, and so come back. But I don't know that the Turks were ever a candidate for the kind of transcontinental. I mean, it is certainly true that the Turks had a transcontinental presence from Central Asia to the Middle East. But their task was more to unify the Islamic world rather than to go much beyond it, although they did penetrate Southeastern Europe as well. So come back in 2 weeks and we will look at the ways in which European empires in the Americas differed from the Ottomans in Turkey, the Russians across Siberia, the Chinese in Central Asia. The Chinese declined to create an empire in the Indian Ocean basin, a maritime empire, but they went on to create a land-based empire in Central Asia. That imperial task they did not decline.
And one more detail.
Sure.
How far did the Mongols actually get in Europe? Did they get to Vienna? And
No, they did not get to Vienna.
but they got Hungary, but not Austria then, huh?
Yes, I don't have the exact geography in my head, but they conquered parts of Poland, Hungary, Germany, or at least they defeated European forces from those areas. And then they went back for the funeral. Sir,
What happened to those mega what happened to the mega ships that you showed in the picture? Are there any models still?
there are
extant?
models of them, yes, yes. But they left them to rot in port. They just turned their back on them. These voyages were the product of this rather aggressive emperor. And supported by the part of the bureaucracy that was led by eunuchs. This antagonized the rest of the bureaucracy who did not favor this. They said that the danger to China comes from the north, not from the oceans. Furthermore, they argued that anything that they needed from outside, other people would bring to them. They didn't need to go out and look for it. But basically, the opponents of these voyages argued that China was mistaking the real source of danger, and that by wandering around the Indian Ocean, they were taking their eyes off the prize, which was these northern barbarians from which the Mongols had come. And so that had a growing constituency in Chinese elite circles. And those voyages were just stopped on a dime.
Were these warships?
Warships?
Yeah.
Yes, yes. They did not have the kind of onboard cannon that the Europeans had. But here's another interesting what-if question. What if those voyages had continued? What if Vasco da Gama, when he came around the coast of Africa with his 3 little boats, would have run up against these huge Chinese fleets? How might things have been different? What if the Chinese had gone on to discover the Americas? I mean, some people have argued that they actually did, although that's not the general opinion, but
Is
Yeah.
that in your book?
I'm sorry?
Is that in the book? About the theory of the Chinese possibly getting to the.
I don't know if I mentioned that. It was popular for a little while, but the evidence for it seems shaky.
At what point did the Chinese build the Great Wall to defend against the?
Oh, it
Invaders.
was an ongoing project for a long time. It probably began 500 or so BCE, and it was built in sections, and it crumbled and it was rebuilt frequently. So it was a very long-term and continuing process to mark the border between agricultural and pastoral areas, as well as an attempt to keep out the barbarians, although they were willing to let them in for trade and so forth. And sometimes they were forced to let them in. The Chinese, the nomadic peoples to the north of the Great Wall, on occasion broke through and forced the Chinese into accommodating them, which they were reluctant to do, but had to nonetheless.
In the Pacific Grove Library, I mean, at the museum in Pacific Grove, they had the Chinese beach at the Chinese community. They have a model of the big junk that took the whole families over from China right to the beach right there, where that community
Oh, really?
existed up until less than 100 years ago
Okay,
when they were burned out. But they have the model and they have the scale model with like the Plymouth ships and stuff like that right there.
well, I wonder if they were modeled at all after Zheng He's.
Well, they were compartmentalized, they said,
Yeah.
so they could make that
Which
voyage.
was, you know, pretty
Uh-huh.
rough voyage, I guess.
Okay, okay. Well, they were coming across the Pacific,
Yeah.
not through the Indian Ocean. Yeah, okay. Yeah,
I actually have a question for you. Is there any evidence that they understood how the Black Death or the plague was being spread? Because you said that many of the cultures were bright, intelligent. Did they have any sense of what was happening?
well, they understood contagion. And the Europeans in particular did take efforts to, not on a coordinated scale, but within certain regions or cities, they took scale to prevent people from leaving, prevent strangers from coming in. So they understood the notion of contagion. Whether they knew exactly what pestilential agent was responsible, now we know something about which, although there's still some controversy about exactly what it was, but it apparently was carried on the backs of rats, and then fleas transmitted it from the rats to human beings. So we know a lot more about it genetically now. Of course, that they were not aware of, but they were aware that it was contagious. There are interesting examples of doctors that would refuse to treat patients because they were afraid of getting it. Well, thank you very much indeed. Lovely to see you.